Recently, Japan has changed its pandemic policies drastically and continues to do so as I speak. From downgrading COVID-19 to the same classification as a seasonal flu, opening its borders to Chinese tourism again, and even easing its mask policy to something reminiscent of pre-pandemic measures. So, after 3 long years, it seems the government is finally taking real steps forward in returning the country to a sense of pre-pandemic normalcy. But with all these major changes, there are some major concerns we have to address, like how will lowering COVID's severity classification affect you? How big of an effect will China's tourism have on your trip to Japan? Because believe me, it will. And finally, the biggest concern, will the government's stance on easing the mask policy actually have an impact on the society as a whole? Well, today we're going to address all of these concerns, so get your thinking caps on and let's get to it. So the first concern we need to address is how will COVID's new classification affect the future of Japan's decision making? Well, in order to understand what this will mean for the future of Japan's policies, we need to understand exactly what this downgrade means. With COVID's current classification, the government can ask its citizens and tourists alike to quarantine at their homes and hotels for up to 7 days after the first onset of their symptoms. Along with the quarantine, the government can also ask all close contacts of that individual to self-isolate for up to 5 days. Sounds a little excessive at this point, if you ask me. Governments can also use COVID as a reason to declare a state of emergency and force restricted movement and business hours. However, under the new classification, quarantine will go away entirely, and more importantly, local governments will not be able to declare COVID-19 as a state of emergency. This means no more ability to restrict business hours, restrict movement, none of that at all. All of that, in turn, means a lot more certainty about any upcoming trips to Japan. Without state of emergencies, you don't have to worry about major cancellations or changes to your plans due to COVID. Unless you actually catch COVID, of course. But this will not take effect until the anticipated date of May 8th, and although it isn't likely, state of emergencies could still happen until COVID is officially downgraded. Now that we've gotten all the quarantine updates out of the way, let's talk about the potentially bigger news that could happen, and that would be the potential change of border measures. As mentioned in multiple articles, government officials have stated that current border measures will be reviewed. As of right now, the government requires citizens and tourists to show proof of 2 vaccinations and 1 booster shot to enter the country. And if they don't have proof of vaccinations, they have to show a negative PCR test before they can enter. But this policy is kind of outdated, as there has been additional booster shots that have been released since this policy was first updated. And if they update entry requirements to show proof of additional booster shots, that will almost certainly decrease the amount of inbound tourists. And with their tourism industry finally making a recovery, I don't think they're willing to let their tourism numbers slide back down to pandemic levels again. I say all that to say this. I think they will do the opposite and will ease COVID entry requirements, if not get rid of them altogether. And I think that will be sooner rather than later, especially if you consider when the officials stated they would review their entry requirements. It wouldn't be unlikely if they timed their border entry updates, along with the announcement to downgrade COVID's classification in May. But that's just my take on it, and we will see what actually happens when they finally make their announcement. Let me know in the comments below what you think will happen. And next, we have the announcement from the government stating that they will allow Chinese tourism again. And this is overall a good thing, as everyone should be able to freely travel around the world like they used to before the pandemic struck. However, there is one caveat to address that will certainly impact your next trip to Japan, and that is the sheer volume of people that will be brought back into the tourism mix. China is one of the most populated countries in the world, with over 1 billion people living inside their borders. So naturally, with a lot of people come a lot of tourists. In 2019, Japan had a total of 31.88 million tourists visit, with China accounting for 9.59 million of them. That means China made up over 30% of Japan's entire tourism industry. Yes, that's right. Over 1/3 of Japan's total tourism came just from China. And with such a high volume of tourists will come much more congested streets, shops, and restaurants throughout Japan. And for anyone that is either living in Japan or anyone that has already visited, you have seen how crowded it is in major cities right now. So if you think it's crowded now, just wait until Japan's tourism is at full throttle again. Not to say it's a bad thing, as everyone should be entitled to explore the world freely and experience everything it has to offer, but just something to consider as you plan your next trip to Japan. So if you're thinking about when to plan your next trip to Japan, I would do it sooner rather than later, as it is only going to get more and more crowded as tourism slowly returns to normal once again. And finally, the mask mandate. As the government just announced last Friday, they will be lifting almost all of their mask recommendations to the public. Currently, the government is asking the public to wear masks in most situations, both indoors and outdoors. But now, with the policy update, mask wearing is going to be reduced to only wearing them in public transport or other extremely crowded areas. This is a massive change to what has been the norm for the past 3 years. Not only is the government asking the public to embrace and live with the COVID downgrade, but they are now asking the public to remove the masks and carry on with their lives as normal. While this all sounds great on paper, you have to ask yourself, will all this really happen overnight? And the answer is probably not. Even if the government makes the move to ease masks in March, the majority of the public will probably keep them on just out of peer social pressure. As some company members have even stated in an interview, quote, "When we meet with people outside our company, we will have no choice but to keep wearing a mask in consideration of them." And if everyone thinks like this, will anything really change? And that's why I don't think it's gonna happen overnight. Japan is a collective society, and the last thing they want to do is disturb others around them. And in this particular case, I feel like it's gonna come down to a who's gonna do it first kind of situation. Either way, this is still a great step forward. Now that the government has set the precedent of not wearing masks, people will feel more comfortable making that decision to take off their own mask and get closer to living in a pre-pandemic environment. But for now, if you're a tourist coming to Japan, just make sure you pack a few masks. However, I would expect to wear it less and less as people become more comfortable about ditching the mask entirely. Comment below your thoughts on everything I've covered in this video. Like this video if you found it useful or interesting, and subscribe for more Japan content like this video right here. Check my Thatch profile in the description below to plan your next trip to Japan, and until then, I'll see you next time.